Does everybody know what time it is? VidNotes time. 6-5. Please get out your 6-5 packets and write down the learning target. I will understand European imperialism and countries' resistance to it. Here's a European leader who's stretching his arms and fingers around Africa. Europe takes over Africa and Asia during this time in history. Let's talk about it. Let's define this I word, imperialism. Definition. Imperialism is a country's plan to increase its power by taking over another country. It involves power, it involves domination. Let's talk about the events that shows imperialism. How did imperialism start? Well, the age of imperialism, which was from 1850 to 1914 in Europe, was caused by the Industrial Revolution. That's right, it was caused by the building of factories and the creation of steam locomotives from steam engines, thanks to James Watt and Eli Whitney's cotton gin. This caused the domination of Europe over Africa and Asia. How did imperialism start? Industrial nations in Europe, here's a map of Europe, especially Western Europe. During the Industrial Revolution, they built factories and they made more goods in these factories. So these industrial nations in Europe, Britain, France, Spain, Germany, they needed natural resources, raw materials, and markets to expand. Excuse me, they needed coal, they needed petroleum, which is used to make oil. They needed natural gas so that they could use it in their factories. And they also needed a place to sell their goods. That's a market. How did imperialism start? These nations in Europe competed to control Africa and Asia in order to gain their own economic and political success. So Europe wants power, and to do so, they need these resources in Africa. How did imperialism spread? Imperialism spread the economic, political, and social philosophies of Europe throughout the world. Here's Europe, and it spreads its ideas when it takes over these different lands. What motivated European imperialism? Motivation. The N word, nationalism, which means pride in country, so right nationalism, motivated European nations to compete, to control colonies. So all of these men who represent different European countries, they're tugging at Africa. I want it, I want it, I want to control it. And they built colonies. What is a colony? Let's define it, right? Colonies, and they're lands that an empire owns beyond its home. This map has an example. Here's Great Britain. I circled it in red. Here it is. That's its home, but Great Britain also owned colonies across the world, in North America, in South America, in Africa. They had major parts, the Gold Coast, Congo. Britain also had a colony called India. They also had a colony called Australia. They owned these lands, so they were an empire. What motivated European imperialism? European economic, military, and political power, please write those words down, forced colonized countries to trade on European terms. The Europeans were the leaders of the negotiations, and other countries and colonies had to go along. How did Europe take over? Industrial produced goods were sold in markets in the colonies. This system displaced, which means took over, the colonies' traditional industries. For example, you have Britain, you have factories in Britain. Well, they are forcing their colonies to sell shirts, for example, that are made in England, not made in the colonies. So made in Africa, no, those shirts were not allowed. If you're an African colony that's owned by Britain, you have to sell English shirts. It's about money. Let's define this phrase that we talked about earlier, and this, what I just said, was an example of it. Mercantilism. Mercantilism. A mother country, aka an empire like Britain, exports, sends out its finished goods to its colonies to make more money. This is mercantilism. An example of mercantilism is England and India. England's the mother country, India's the colony. Write these down. India is England's colony. It's number one. Number two, India sends raw materials to England. Follow the line. Three, England's factories turn these raw materials into finished products. Number four, England sends the product to its colony, India, for people to buy. That is mercantilism. Asia and Africa resist. European mercantilism and imperialism were not fair to colonies in Asia and Africa. These colonies resisted, meaning they fought back. How did Asia and Africa resist? Colonized people resisted European domination in many ways. 3 ways. Violence, using their military to push back. Religion, using their faith. And nationalism, coming together to say we have pride in our own culture. We don't want these foreign Europeans ruining it for us. How did Asia and Africa resist? I offer one example. The Sepoy Rebellion in India, which happened in 1857. 2 sides. You have the fighters from India on this side of the painting. They were called sepoys. They were born and raised in India. They have pride. Versus the British soldiers, the redcoats. Britain owned India, but the Indians want independence. So who wins in 1857? The British win the Sepoy Rebellion, and India remains a colony of Britain. That is it. You're almost done. Think of one question you want to ask about the content, about the information in this lesson. Write it down. And then when you are done with that, you are done with lesson 6-5. This is Mr. Deegan in room D226 signing off.